Okay, welcome everybody. This is the first of the sessions on planning and productivity. As I mentioned to a couple of people before we started, what I'd like to do is we're going to run in presentation mode for the presentations. We have a 10 minutes presentations, and then we'll have 10 minutes of discussion, I think, for each one, 5 to 10 minutes, depending on how it goes. But what I'd like to do is during the discussion time, I'm going to open up everybody's mic so that you have control of your own mics and your own cameras. And so I would hope that you would put your questions in the chat session. Lloyd will monitor them. But when we come to the question, we'll give you the option of turning on your mic yourself and asking the question and possibly having an exchange. And that should hopefully make things go smoother than having to continually change people's status whenever they want to talk. I would also encourage people during the Q&A sessions to turn on your cameras, just because it's really nice to see who's in the room. And it just makes it feel a bit more like a conference, not quite live, but more like a conference. But anyway, to start, I want to start with, we have 3 papers, which on the one hand seem like they're quite different, but I've at least picked out some common themes, and hopefully they'll come out more in the questions. And we're going to start with Oliver Disney and Oskar Fahlstedt's paper on site overheads.
Hello, and welcome to our presentation. I'm Oliver Disney, and my colleague Oskar Fahlstedt will be joining me today as we present our paper, Site Overheads, the Lost Dimension of Improved Productivity. We worked with a housing department from a large Swedish contractor from which managers and employees felt that their allmänna kostnader, roughly translated as common costs, had been increasing to unacceptable levels compared with competitors, which meant that they were losing out on small and medium-sized projects. A few years ago, this wasn't a problem for them, but tougher market conditions have forced them to focus more on cost. So what do we mean by allmänna kostnader, a term used by the Swedish contractor? The most common similar terms are preliminaries or site overheads. It's a term used for site-specific costs that cannot be directly allocated to individual activities, for example, scaffolding that is used for roof work, painting a facade, and installing windows. There are 4 primary cost categories, which represent up to 80% of total site overheads. These are usually site management, large machines, scaffolding, and site offices. In total, they are a significant proportion of overall project costs. Defining which resources are included as site overheads, especially the smaller cost categories, is often unclear as it's ambiguously defined and there's no consistent method for calculating them. Our initial aim was to work with the company by conducting interviews and a survey to categorize which resources should be included as site overheads, which would enable them to draw more detailed comparisons between projects. But as you will soon hear, there were some challenges and we had to take a different approach. We interviewed both office and site workers who all had a different understanding of which costs should be allocated as site overheads. They also had very different techniques for estimating these costs, where we were even told there's an additional budget for items that they have simply forgotten about. Site managers then face pressure to cut these costs, but as long as the projects make money, they said it doesn't really matter how the costs were allocated. They just simply all move on to the next project and there's no real incentive to improve. They even added that it was easy to get lazy or forget about during the projects. Despite this, when asked, the employees still considered the concept of managing site overheads important. They also thought that they were knowledgeable about the subject, but when prompted to define and explain it, they really struggled. What we found is that all of the interviewees defined it differently. Their definition was based on their own experiences and co-workers' perception of common practice. During the research process, we learned that an official definition for these site overheads already existed within the company in a PowerPoint. It had been sent to everyone, however, only the person that had wrote it and sent it to everyone even knew it existed. For the rest of this presentation, I'm going to hand you over to my colleague, Oskar.
Thank you, Oliver. When it comes to the methods being used within the company, they varied almost as much as the definition of what site overheads actually are. One interesting case in particular was when a logistics engineer who worked part-time with only focusing on site overheads and was highly regarded by some of the other employees as one of the kind of wizard when it comes to managing site overheads. Although, as we discovered when conducting the interview, we saw that the interviewee still added a 10% to every cost prediction in the end to cover for any unforeseen costs, which was very interesting. Some others regarded the methods you should use is clear communication and put responsibility down the chain to site manager from site manager to site supervisors to make sure that everybody takes care of their own specific area, and then they become more meticulous with their cost as well. And some didn't think that there was any reason to categorize cost at all. They rather believe that everything should be optimized as much as possible. You should always care about your cost. And as long as you are within the percentage limit given by the site, the estimators, then you're fine. So with that also entails that people sometimes move the cost between accounts to make that overhead cost be within the given limit provided by the estimators. Then we move on to some evaluation of this work, the findings of the work, and we see a quote here that's painting us quite a vivid image how it worked within the company. As one of the interviewed estimating managers said, that you need to use a mix of guessing and thorough calculations when estimating ARCOM, which is referred to as site overheads within the company. And this means that they kind of know what the site overheads are, but at the same time they rely very much on a percentage, between 10 and 15% of the total cost. And in a similar way as the logistics engineer just added 10% for any unforeseen cost, even though the reputation said that the logistics engineer was very good at had a very good method of handling site overheads. Thus revealing that there's a need for a categorization and a definition of what the costs actually are if they want to be more accurate. And this has created some kind of a divide between office and site managers, as estimators create this percentage that they give to the site managers and say that you have to be within this limit on your project. And the site managers don't really understand which cost to include, and in the end they can just manipulate the sheets and the costing system. So they move resources from one account to another account to just make sure that within the percentage limit, which causes the problem with inaccurate feedback data for the estimating managers, thus making it even harder for them to create more accurate bids. And the site managers very much work with trial and error in ARC methods, and to decide that this method might work now. They might use a digital tool or a scorecard or something, and then it doesn't work. They're trying to change a bit, and it very much depend on which site manager is working with what, and depending on which peers the site manager is working with and the background of the site managers. So it's very much left to the judgment and intuition of the site managers to decide how to allocate these costs. And this leaves us with some concluding remarks for the implication and next steps for the company. They have a poor understanding of what site overheads really are, as everybody is putting their own value and judgment to what to include, and some define it as physical things, as handheld tools or scaffolding, and some define it as other, like management, for example. And the skill and agility of the site manager, everything is very much left to the site managers to handle this. And we think is some kind of a way it works, because the site managers is the one who solves the problem ad hoc as they occur, and if they can handle their overheads in a good way, that's a way of them showing that I'm a good site manager. So it's not really any incentive to improve either, because if you can decide yourself what the overheads are, you can easily make sure that you are within the limit as well. therefore, we think it's maybe necessary to renew the costing technique they're using and then move away from this one-stage costing that relies on square meters or the specific amount of scaffolding or time. Instead, move to activity-based costing, which looks at what are the activities that are inducing this cost in the background, and then therefore they might get a better understanding of the site might get a better understanding of what the costs are, and then they can allocate them better and therefore get better feedback data to the estimators, and then break this vicious circle they are in as of now. And in the end, you need to think, does site overheads really matter? Because if the market goes up and they win more bids and there becomes more production in general, it tends to be less important with overhead cost. Therefore, they should really think how they want to work with it. Because even though they have quite high site overheads, they're still going with a profit. They're still surviving. So, is it vital? Is it necessary? Or is it just something that's coming from top management who wants to point fingers and say that this is important and we need to take care of this now? And with that said, I would like to thank you for all of you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation and the paper. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for the paper. Are there any questions at the moment? As I said, I'm going to shift us into discussion mode, and I would encourage anybody who's willing to do so, please turn on your camera just because I have people in the room. Perhaps I can start with a first question, and then we can broaden out the discussion. One of the things I found interesting about your paper, I find it interesting in general, and thank you for the presentation. One of the things that, from my perspective, was really interesting about it was this question that, I think this tension within construction between formalized definitions of what to count and how to count it, and the exercise of professional judgment, whether we call it relying on experience or relying on expertise or relying on their judgment, is something that is common in a lot of different aspects of construction work. And in your paper, you kind of present the professional reliance on their judgment as quite random. Some do this, some do that. And I'm wondering if there's any logics to how people evaluate. Did you see any regularities in how different people exercise that judgment, and whether there might be something lost by moving to too much formalization or standardization?
Honestly, well, thank you for the question, first of all. It was great. Honestly, there seemed to be a lot of standardization within the estimator themselves that was calculating from one project to the next. They all had their own techniques, but there was no kind of maybe standardization between the different estimators at the company. So, for example, one, I think, estimator did a very rough guesswork based on direct costs. He used a percentage. One of them liked to calculate everything in detail, and a different one used really extensive spreadsheets to calculate all the different items. So there was no kind of standardization between them, but they all said they've been working in that way, and some worked in that way from working at previous companies as well, which then they brought into this new company. But they didn't really seem to communicate between each other to ever improve anything. It's hard to say how it would be in the future as well if they did work all together, but it did feel very random at the moment, and the site managers then reflected in that too. They didn't really understand whether these costs were meant to be 6% in some projects or 12% in others as well. They just kind of got presented with a figure and were told, here you go, fix it and come in under budget, please.
Okay, thanks. Barry, it looks like you have a question. Do you want to ask it in person? If you just click the link next to your camera and your audio, you'll be able to ask the question. Here, I tried to start your audio.
Yes, is that working?
Yeah, now
absolutely. We can hear you.
Yeah. Hi, guys. Hi. Yeah, the first one was just a general observation, so there wasn't a question there. And I guess the second point's probably more important. The overheads in the UK context, from my own professional experience, we kind of lump together overheads and profit. And I just remember that these were one of the only areas that directors could address before trying to win work. So there was a lot of disproportionate interest in trying to reduce these when work was scarce, but when there's abundant work, there's not so much focus on. So I noticed a lot of the paper that talked about there was the emphasis on reducing these. Everything else gets subcontracted out, so we can't really, influence those costs. So from my own experience, there was hours and hours of meetings, and do you need 3 labourers? Can you get by with 2 labourers on this job? That type of thing. So I'm just saying, same story, different context, right? Over in Sweden, over in the UK, that's construction. Is that what you guys found?
Yes, I mean, I think definitely it was exactly like that you said. Things were going very well. They didn't really care about it, and then they faced tougher times, and all of a sudden it became this big problem and something that they needed to focus on more. And then they realized in some projects it was like really high, some projects it was really low, but they had no way of kind of comparing between the two of them as the way things currently stand. And I mean, just a simple example of why that can be as well is, for example, if you hire like a steel contractor in one project, which brings their own crane, the costs are allocated differently to compared with if you then hire a steel contractor and hire a crane yourself. But the kind of management didn't understand these issues, even though the site managers did.
I mean, I know I'm being provocative, but is there possibly a advantage for the contractor at being able to hide those costs at time and only partially report them, and at other times report them fully? Again, I'm just wondering about this idea that having everything perfect is better, and if we all had perfect information, everything would be better, and that there's no logics informing the ways people manage these reported costings. It's purely being devil's advocate.
I think it's a good point. And one of the kind of main findings we found from the paper is, we went in there and were told, like, can you help us with the categorization of these costs? Because in some projects, these costs are really high. We want to kind of have a good understanding of exactly where the costs are allocated and which parts of the costs are high. But I mean, we came in and found that they didn't even have an understanding of what these costs actually were. The office kind of thought that they should have a good understanding on the site, but I mean, even in the office, they had very different interpretations and struggled between themselves. And then on the sites, it was even worse, where the definitions kind of varied extensively between them. So I think definitely on the sites as well, they did find some advantage to hiding these costs as well, because when maybe certain costs were too high, they could just put it in like another account and sort of hide it, like you were saying as well. In the end, it didn't really matter where the costs were allocated because there was no follow-up. They just sort of put the costs where they could.
Henning, you seem to have a question and then you didn't type it. Do you want to ask something as a last question? Henning, we can't hear you. Try again.
Now you should hear me.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, what I found with 2 calculators in my company was that the one was calculating often by percentage, and the other one was almost counting every nail. And there was sometimes the one calculator who says, look, if I'm doing this and getting perfect numbers, I need endless time to calculate the offer. That was his biggest problem. Therefore, he used percentage points often to just cope with the time pressure he had calculating the offers. And so a perfect knowledge might be a nice thing, but it's impossible in the construction management setting with the time pressures we are facing.
Yeah. Can maybe just add to that a little bit? Yeah, we definitely found that they calculated in several different ways, the different kind of estimators, the calculators. But even then, the ones that did calculate it in detail, they still, for example, added 10% for items that that they knew they would have maybe forgotten about. Not like as an extra resource or in case something went wrong or if the budget needed to be increased, but just 10%, as he said himself, the things that they had forgotten about. So we think it could obviously be improved a lot more by some standardization, maybe working more together and kind of a learning environment within the company too.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to move us on to the next one, and hopefully at the end we'll have time for a bit more discussion. Our next presentation is by Jessica Molén and Daniella Troje about how motivation and culture affect O&M knowledge sharing in school construction. And I will start the video and close down the discussion for now. And we can come back to the discussion afterwards.
Hi, I'm going to present a research named How Motivation and Culture Affect O&M Knowledge Sharing in School Construction, a case study of a Swedish public organization. I am Jessica Molén from KTH in Stockholm, and my co-writer is Daniella Troje, also from KTH. In Sweden, municipalities are responsible for planning and building schools. Inadequately planned buildings and other construction and design deficiencies cost society vast sums of money, leading to strong incentives to improve construction processes in terms of increased accessibility to knowledge in early design phase so that buildings can be planned better. Better buildings enable pupils to thrive and also to fulfill environmental aspects within economic limitations. This requires effective sharing of operations and maintenance, O&M, knowledge between the early design phase and the user phase. Previous research points to the importance of integrating O&M knowledge in the early design phase and how knowledge sharing is key for long-term building performance in the user phase, but also that it can be difficult in practice. The purpose of this study is to investigate how an organization responsible for the construction, property management, and O&M of schools in a large Swedish municipality organize their knowledge management activities to enable knowledge sharing between the early design phase and the user phase to benefit long-term performance of the school buildings. We chose to focus on how motivation and mechanisms in the culture of the work environment spawn knowledge sharing. The willingness to participate in knowledge processes depends on different factors, where motivation and the culture of the work environment are two important ones. Autonomous motivation, meaning that individuals share knowledge, either because they enjoy it or because knowledge sharing activities aligns with their values and is personally meaningful to them. And control motivation is what stems from external incentives, for example, to reap rewards or to avoid sanctions. As for the culture, influential factors such as opportunities to share, time openness, and trust, and organizational values all have an impact on the knowledge actually shared. To understand the company culture and how motivation was encouraged, we interviewed employees in different managerial and operative positions. We also observed meetings and other forums, as well as going through and analyzing internal documents. This particular public company was chosen because it is, by other public organizations, seen as a role model regarding school construction projects because of their massive experience and their ability to come up with sustainable, innovative solutions. It was shown that the company involves the operations and maintenance in the design phase and even earlier stages of the construction process. And by doing that, they are integrating O&M knowledge early, and they also appointed the property management as the project owner. To reap benefits from this, the knowledge sharing has to be sufficient, and the company has come to find ways to encourage motivation and culture of the work environment to achieve that. This spawns efficient project processes, generates more unanimous collaboration and goal orientation in projects, leads to innovation and energy savings, and inspires loyalty and pride among the employees. Sharing internal knowledge externally also benefits wider society. An important source of motivation is the overall purpose to provide children and society with high-quality schools and preschools, making a difference for the children. The fact that the employees themselves have children of their own provides a more personally meaningful source of motivation, strongly connected to emotions as empathy and pride. One said, quote, "We work for the children, and therefore we want to do good stuff," end quote. This goes deep within the mindset and routines, including the willingness to create new knowledge and to share knowledge. While constantly sharing knowledge with each other, the eagerness for acquiring even more detailed knowledge grows. By building good schools with innovative technical solutions and by daring to try new things, employees feel proud of what the company does, and thereby say they feel motivated to share the knowledge and practices of the company. As management nurture such emotions and social relationships, knowledge sharing becomes easy. Core organizational values aimed at knowledge sharing are established and incorporated, leading to a mindset where knowledge sharing is seen as important and fulfilling. It's perceived that knowledge sharing and positive emotions like pride leads to producing better products. And when the employees are proud of the products they produce, they want to share the knowledge with others. The company has adopted a very forgiving attitude, a mentality that sees made mistakes as opportunities for learning and development, with benefits for society. Managers have adopted a behavior where making mistakes is shown to be okay, both by standing by their staff even when people make mistakes, and by being open about making mistakes themselves. The employees are encouraged to try new things that, successful or not, at least result in new knowledge. The foundation is built on trust and safety, promoting knowledge sharing, and negative emotions such as fear are limited. Promoting experimenting is beneficial to the organization's long-term development. The CEO emphasized the importance of supporting the employees' decisions. I quote, "Later on, it might appear that economically it failed, and then you correct the mistake and alter it. But I will always support the decision you made, because you based it on the prerequisites you had when you made a decision. And if you're value-driven, then it will be right 99 times out of 100. End quote. As it is okay to fail, it's okay to expose what you do not know, and thereby it's okay to ask all questions needed to obtain new required knowledge. Top management have a genuine attitude that is encouraging employees to interact with others and share knowledge. The sharing behavior is also clearly promoted in the organizational core values. By creating opportunities for sharing and creating knowledge, such as different forums for exchanging experiences and perceptions, relations flourish and complex and very detailed issues are discussed and managed. This study shows how individuals can be motivated to share knowledge with their colleagues and others, and how this motivation, in combination with a culture conducive to knowledge sharing, can lead to individuals autonomously creating new opportunities for knowledge sharing and knowledge creation. This study also highlights how organizations can be well served by consciously creating a fearless culture that becomes self-reinforcing in terms of inspiring employees to voluntarily seek opportunities for collaboration and knowledge sharing. As one interviewee said, quote, "By doing nothing, then you've done 100% wrong. By doing something, then you have a chance of getting it 50% right." End quote. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. I don't know if we can get our speakers up on the screen, so we have, if you can turn your cameras on. Lloyd, maybe you can help with that. Do we have any questions? Or perhaps I can start with the first question. Let me just try to get Jessica. And then, so we can see you. Great. Maybe I'll start with the first question, if that's okay. It's a very inspiring paper, I must say. You paint a picture of a beautiful world where everybody is open to knowledge sharing and there are no costs for making mistakes, and everybody has a shared culture and a shared organization. And, I want to join. Where do I sign up? But the question is, this is very much at odds with the usual image that we get of construction projects and projects involving lots of different firms that have distinct or different cultures, and there being quite a lot of tensions between different people's interests or different people's visions. So I guess one question that was interesting to me about your paper was what do you see as the relationship between, on the one hand, shared values and on the other hand, shared knowledge, because they're not quite the same thing. And then the second kind of question related to that is really, at moments you mentioned that this was sort of a situation of experimentation, and I'm wondering whether there were conditions that supported this shared knowledge that might not translate into commercial settings, fully commercial settings, or if that actually isn't a consideration. So those are my questions.
Okay, I can start. Thank you. Thank you for your inspirational talk there. The first question, the connection between core values and the knowledge sharing. Is that what you wanted to know? Mm-hmm. Did I understand you right? Yeah.
And whether they're the same thing, because you seem to talk about them always going together.
Yes, because the core values are very important, and the literature talks about that too. And it showed in the study that their core values talk a lot about sharing knowledge, and it was deeply. It was very. The CEO and the whole organization were establishing these values to make sure that this knowledge sharing was constantly going on. Do you want to add something, Daniella?
Yes. I guess we could also say that obviously it's when we did interviews with this company, the interviews were very inspiring for us as well. With that said, obviously it wasn't smooth sailing all the time. So for example, the more planning department and the maintenance department sometimes had trouble sharing knowledge, partly because they had very different educational backgrounds and they had different local work cultures within their respective departments. So even though the company talked about having this grander shared vision in practice on a daily basis, obviously there were nuances between different departments that made knowledge sharing sometimes not as easy or as natural as the company would have liked. So in that sense, I would say that there were differences when it came to values and knowledge sharing, and they didn't always line up as intended on a practical basis.
And in your case, were the designers, the design engineers, employed by the same firm as the client, as the public organization? Or were there multiple firms involved in your case study?
Well, it was mostly the one case company, so they had a lot of in-house knowledge. They had consultants for some things, but basically they had more of a planning department and a facilities management department in-house.
Great. Does anybody else want to follow up with questions? You can either put them in the comments. It looks like Stina is typing away. We can maybe open her camera. Stina, did you have a question?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes. Can you see me? No, you can't. I think
we can't see you.
Okay.
No. Yes, now you can see me. Hi. So thank you very much for the presentation. I had a question because I was from when I read the paper, it seemed like this new CEO had quite a big impact on creating this new culture that allowed for knowledge sharing to happen. And would you agree on that? And the second question, because as I understood, this was a public organization, and if you compare it to, for instance, these construction projects where you have these temporary organizations, do you think it's more difficult to create this kind of of culture in these, because you don't have this CEO that, can do this?
Yes, of course. The CEO had a great impact. Yes, he did. When he came in a few years ago, they used to have another type of CEO with the other values. So he came in with some kind of new values with the core of sharing knowledge. So that's his mantra: share, share, share. In the project teams, there are a lot of consultants. Yes, and they talked about the difficulties of. They of course too have these difficulties of spreading the culture of sharing throughout the project teams with the external consultants and stuff. So yes, that's their challenges, I would say.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
My question is, could you say a little bit more about how this spread of the culture, how it worked, and maybe also related to the external stakeholders and the consultants and the engineers and the contractors maybe who were involved? Because spreading the culture within the client organization is one thing, but how did you also were able to take into account the inter-organizational relations with the architects and the designers, or was your research limited to the client organization?
No, this organization have a lot of external forums where they invite all their consultants and other consultants that they may have collaborations with in the future, and invite them to have discussions and to share their knowledge with these consultants and spread their culture all over.
Okay, and what are the mechanisms about how this culture is spread? Are they different internally versus externally? Because I can imagine that contractual arrangements are also working in relations with contractors and suppliers and architects and designers, and that's maybe different than a colleague sitting in the room next to you every day, or
yes,
or maybe not. I don't know. But
maybe Daniella, do you want to answer this?
Well, one thing that we could say is that they had a very proficient marketing team within this organization. So I feel like they tried to apply the same sort of internal marketing strategies also for all of their external forums. With that said, obviously it is different when you can just knock on a colleague's door and ask a question and have that day-to-day contact. But one thing that they did that I thought was really interesting, or we thought was really interesting, was that all of the results that they did in their different projects, if they had special innovation projects and that sort of thing, they published all of those results on their website. So other companies who I guess you could sort of say are competitors could actually learn from that as well, which I would say is a pretty unique strategy to have as an organization, to be willing to share sort of company secrets in that way. But they felt that if we do something good and the rest of the industry can learn from that and do that as well, then all of us benefit, not just the industry, but also because this is about schools, the children benefit, society benefits. So they did have a very sort of unique strategy in that way.
I would also say that they were spreading this culture to other municipalities this way, by sharing things on their websites, other municipalities, and they can visit the other municipalities could visit them and have like special meetings with them and look at their schools and things like that. So they were sharing their culture to more organizations than just consultants. Yeah.
So, as I said, an inspirational paper and an inspirational firm or
Thank you very much.
client,
Yes.
certainly. Okay. I'm going to move to the next paper unless there's one last observation that somebody wants to make. Henning, do you want to make it really quick with a really short answer? Please. We can't hear you. Henning, you should be on.
Yeah, should be on.
Yeah. All right, really short.
So I'm on?
Yes,
yep.
Please.
Yes. Go for it, we can hear you.
How did they deal with people that did not play the game, so that did not share knowledge, they didn't comply with the culture?
I would say that those people were not staying in this company, this organization. They may have started there and started working there, but maybe in a year they were gone.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. Okay, we're going to now move on to the next presentation. So I'm going to shift the mode to the presentation mode. And I'd like to introduce the next paper, which is by Dan Musselwhite, Barry Gledson, and David Greenwood on matters affecting construction project level planning effectiveness.
Hello everybody, thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation on the research project Matters Affecting Construction Project Level Planning Effectiveness. Just before we get into the research project, a short introductory slide. My name's Dan Musselwhite. I've been in the construction industry for around 20 years, professionally as a planner and project manager, and this research project is supported by Dr. Barry Gledson and Professor David Greenwood of Northumbria University. So to provide some context to the research, the project is focused on improving our objective short-term success within construction, and in particular addressing time performance, and as a subcategory of time performance, our time predictability performance. Now, there's overwhelming industry data available that demonstrates a recurrent substandard performance when it comes to time predictability. Annually collated industry data from the year 2000 to the year 2018 on screen now demonstrates that we are stuck in this middle third when it comes to our ability to predict how long it is going to take to complete construction projects. We're about 58% in 2018, which is actually lower than in the year 2000, almost 20 years prior. There's similar data that puts this statistic around the 50 to 54% mark, but regardless, there's a persistent inability to accurately predict how long it is going to take to complete construction projects. So to address this substandard time predictability performance, the research aim of this project was to determine matters affecting construction planning effectiveness via review of subject literature. This is phase one of a multi-phase research project to address planning effectiveness. As a flowchart, that would look something like this on screen now. In the first instance, if we can plan better and establish better time targets, that may lead to improved time predictability, which is then the subcategory of time performance, which will then feed into project success. So this research project is focused on that front end of how to plan better, how to increase our planning effectiveness. To achieve this research aim, a methodology was put together which launched a systematic type literature review using keyword searches to go through databases like the ARCOM database and similar journal entries, the RICS, CIOB, Project Manager's Book of Knowledge, to create a catalogue of relevant source data for consideration. That started with 3,000 results, got added to by a further 622 until a combined and filtered list of results was used as the source data for this research. Before we consider the results of that literature-based research, I'm first going to pay attention to the phrase project level planning effectiveness. Now, when we look at time performance and time predictability in a traditional sense, it's a very high level binary assessment as to whether projects finish on time or not. Little attention is given to the planning that feeds into that ultimate time performance output. This research, however, builds upon preceding research and analyses our time predictability performance at a micro level. It analyses the attainment of time predictions at an activity by activity basis and converts the attainment of those targets into an overall planning efficiency. It does that by looking at activity hits or misses based on the criteria on screen now, and this research project has been focused on what matters are affecting planning effectiveness, i.e. the ability to hit the targets set at a micro level, and considers that in an overall time predictability manner. So turning our attention to the results of the literature-based research, we grouped the matters affecting planning effectiveness into 3 main categories, and the first of those categories was the project environment, and in particular the complexity of the project environment, in consideration that construction projects are deemed complex systems. The research demonstrates that complexity can come from physical constraints on a scheme, the size of a project, technical complexity such as a high level of services, or just simply the unique one-off nature of construction projects. Research subdivides that slightly into technical complexity, analyzability, and task difficulty. Sitting alongside complexity and adding to complexity, the research demonstrates uncertainty is a significant factor in construction projects, be it in the uncertainty in the information available, the environment that the work's going to be delivered in, uniformity or unpredictability. Now, uncertainty is usually highest at the front end of a scheme and reduces as we near the objective and time elapses. However, time targets are usually set right at the front end of a project when uncertainty is at its highest, and therefore it's not surprising that uncertainty and complexity can influence how time predictability performance. Research talks about incorporating a complexity factor to consider all of the above. Perhaps there's a program float which may influence planning effectiveness, and therefore the project environment is certainly a matter that can influence planning effectiveness. The second category of matters affecting planning effectiveness from the research is cognitive matters. Research exists that suggests that there's an imperfect human behaviour to place more weight behind perceived gains than perceived losses in situations of risk. Now, construction project planning and setting time targets brings in situations of risk, and therefore we have an imperfect human behaviour to have a bias towards being optimistic in these situations. In construction planning, that might lead to us setting unattainable, ambitious targets, often referred to as the planning fallacy. Some research exists that suggests that this bias towards being optimistic is at the root cause of cost and time overruns in construction projects. In planning, this means that we're constantly neglecting historic distributional data and setting incorrect time targets for projects in the future. We may have historic data that suggests something should take 12 months to complete, yet we still say that we can do it in 10 months and then fail with our time predictions. To deal with this, some suggest that we should reduce our bias in the programme and set a more realistic time target. However, that brings in the potential of the phenomenon of Parkinson's law, suggesting that we need to strike a balance between setting overly optimistic and ambitious targets in the first instance, or setting too easy a target and allowing the effects of Parkinson's law to come into a project, reducing our effort and taking longer to complete a project. Therefore, cognitive matters do require consideration when looking at planning effectiveness at a project level. The third category of matters affecting planning effectiveness from the research is the techniques and technology applied during the planning process. Now, the industry go-to for project planning for a good number of years has been a deterministic critical path method planning communicated via Gantt chart, and it's this method that I see on an almost daily basis in practice. However, in consideration that our time performance scores don't appear to be improving for the last 20 so years, maybe it is time for a change. Sitting alongside this traditional method of project planning, there are alternative methods available, and access to technology is also improving across the industry. The alternative methods, such as the probabilistic planning methods or the last planner system, may improve things, and the access to technology using things like 4D modelling, artificial intelligence, or the increased use of off-site manufacture all may improve planning effectiveness. And research does exist suggesting a link between alternative methods and technology and improvements in project planning. And therefore techniques and technology do require consideration when looking at planning effectiveness. Following the research, a conceptual framework was developed to capture each of the matters identified as affecting planning effectiveness across the three main categories discussed of project environmental matters, cognitive matters, and planning techniques and technologies. Each of the items within this framework have been shown to have an association with planning effectiveness, which can be measured in activity hit rates at a micro level, as described earlier in the presentation. This can then be followed up to assess how planning effectiveness can influence time predictability performance, and then how time predictability performance links into the overall time performance category of the iron triangle shown at the start of the presentation. The development of the conceptual framework brings us to a discussion as to the next steps that follow this research project. The intention is to use this framework to inform the design of further research instruments to, one, test the completeness of the framework, and then two, measure current planning effectiveness performance across the industry at micro level. The intention is to use the improved access to market through practice to collate primary survey data supplemented by some secondary archival program data to analyse current planning effectiveness performance. The intention is to utilise this research project to inform the secondary research project. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation, and I look forward to the question and answers session. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you very much for the paper. I shifted us again to discussion mode so that people can get their picture in themselves and turn on their audio if they'd like. I will again start with a question. People who know me know I'm a sociologist. So, excuse me? Is there a problem?
No. You're muted, Libby.
Muted, all right. Can people hear me now?
Yep.
Okay,
Yep.
great. So I'm going to start with a question again. For people who know me, it is a sociological question. But when you talk about the constraints on whether time people deliver projects to time or not, I of course always think about whether there's also institutional constraints. And I remember a colleague of mine, Will Hughes, used to always say that, at least in the UK, the tendering process is such that in order to win a project, you had to underestimate the amount of time it would take. So he thought it was actually a great success that projects would run over time, because it meant at least they were being built in a robust way that the buildings would survive. So, but the question is really whether, there aren't actually structural incentives so one issue has to do with the question of why do people underestimate the amount of time? And is it really just either they're being over-ambitious or over-optimistic or over-cautious, or whether there are actually good reasons why at a certain moment in the project you might underestimate the time? And then the other question actually has to do again with a question that I asked for our first paper with Oskar and Oliver about the place of discretion. And we know that programs are continually being adjusted throughout the course of a project, and that they're often being adjusted on the basis of discussions between the different stakeholders and what's a problem that arose and how much time do we need, and can you do it by this amount of time? And isn't, I guess, why is it that, do we really need a new tool, or maybe those adjustments are actually what's essential in order to deliver the project to the remit that was initially given? So these are just sort of devil's advocate questions again for you to engage with, perhaps.
Yeah, no problem. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Excellent stuff. Thanks for your comments. I think you are correct in the suggestion that there's an element of almost need to make a mistake in predictions made in order to potentially either win a job or for the job to be potentially successful. Comes from an element of competitiveness in the industry, estimating. I remember working with an estimator many years ago and said the only time he ever won a job was when he missed something. And that's how you win a job. You miss something and you battle for the coming months and years to try and make the job pay. I think overall there is this industry desire to achieve completion on time, whether that generates commercial incentives, if we're going to make some better money by finishing on time, or whether there's a morale thing, or there's an end user element to it, things schools are going to get it finished on time, bringing in a school from the last presentation that, releases and end user access. So there's definitely a desire out there to try and improve this performance, and hopefully it's not through making mistakes or an estimating process or setting time targets in the first place that releases that. So I think just coming to your second comment about sort of like a perfect world and do we need more tools and things, I think I was listening to that first presentation, and a common theme I was picking up was this sort of feedback loop. How do we monitor performance, and how are we monitoring, and if that monitoring's getting incorrect feedback, and how's that loop then being broken? I think we do want better data. We can't seek for performance improvements without better data. Perhaps not necessarily a new tool, but at least an improved awareness of things that are influencing our performance would help. And at the moment, the research project definitely reveals, and as does my sort of history and practice, reveals that this not a common understanding as to what the cause of the problem is. And I think more shedding light on this cause of the problem would definitely help across the industry.
Agreed. Barry, do you want to come in and add something here?
Yeah, can you hear me, guys?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I've sort of typed, I always do this, I typed it out, I'm going to say the same thing, but in our discussions, I mean, this is Dan's first year of a part-time 5-year PhD project, so it's literature review stage. And we've had great discussions about, the planning fallacy and the work of Bent Fleeberg, who talks about strategic misrepresentation in work winning. So that certainly aligns with the first comment that you made, Libby, in terms of I would call it lying, but strategic misrepresentation is a better sort of more palatable way of putting it, isn't it? And what Dan's work does really well in the 10 pages of the ARCOM format is it balances that side of things, the sharp pencil syndrome, as I would call it, when you're estimating and trying to win work, with the actual real life things that do affect progress. So I wanted to say, yes, that's informing the work. Your second comment, I'm sorry I missed this. I'd like to contribute, but I missed what it was. So if you want to tell me again, or if anyone else wants to jump in, but that's the main point I wanted to make about Fleeberg, the strategic misrepresentation.
I guess my other point had to do with whether there wasn't a benefit to the continual readjustment of the program that goes on in the course of a project. As supplies, there's a shortage of a supply, so you have to readjust something, or the timing of one phase doesn't finish at the right moment, and whether one really wants to reduce everything to a formal tool that's set at the very beginning, or whether that readjustment work is actually also contributes to the productivity of the project or to the completion of the project.
Well, it is a thing. It is. I mean, Graham Winch calls this the dynamic reduction of uncertainty over time. You don't know at the start, at the outset, all the information. So is there a benefit? Again, Dan's work explores this idea of the rolling wave planning and getting more detailed over time, and it is a wicked problem. But there's a lot going on. So how can we look at this? We can look at individual projects, individual project phases, individual activities, and measure whether they're actually achieving, their hit rates, as we put it in the paper, and all of these things aggregate up to industry level, how we perform at industry level. I don't know if that's a good enough answer, but that's that's where it's coming from. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Libby, could I ask a question?
Please go for it.
So I suppose my question surrounds the construction project type. And I'm just wondering, have Dan, Barry, and David considered project type in relation to how that affects levels of planning effectiveness?
I think it's definitely something that's been considered, and I think as part of the sort of future research, when you go to market and gather data regarding planning effectiveness, it would be interesting to see whether there is a commonality between performance across types. From experience, it's much easier to plan a new build, for example, than it is a refurb because of all the things that can go wrong on refurb projects. So I'd be vastly expecting a difference in performance across project types for certain. Yeah.
Well, Well, go on, then I'll chip in here. The next stage of the PhD project will be data collection. So that there is an opportunity to further scope the ultimate projects. We could do analysis of a particular project type or compare different types of projects. But my great insight here, from my experience in planning and doing a similar piece of research previously, is that in construction, we're actually quite good at predicting fairly accurately performance of year one of a project, right? As in getting out of the ground and putting the structural frame up. But we're remarkably bad at predicting year two of a project, which is the internal works, any, hotel, medical facility, whatever it is. Now, whether it's to do with information certainty in year one, or whether just builders are better at building, and there's more sort of client-side input in year two. That's another sort of theme that the project can explore. So I have this kind of nascent idea that the hit rates in year one are quite good and the hit rates in year two are terrible. If we can divide a project into 50%, two halves. But that's something I'm still playing with.
Okay, I think we're at 12:30, so if anybody needs to leave, that's fine. But why don't we end with 2 more questions or comments? Eamon, I think you have one, and then Tina seems to be typing, so we'll let Tina in after that. But Eamon, over to you. You should be able to accept the video and turn it on.
Yes, hi, I think you can see me now.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, it wasn't so much a question, really, just I put it into the chat a second ago. In my own research, I came across something similar to this with a PhD that Vincent Hackett had done about the last planner system and the development of this teamwork design application. And I see he's still doing some current action research on the same thing to track float and to track current planning timelines against what's physically happening on site. So maybe it might be worth checking that out for yourselves as well as you go forward to data collection.
Yeah, certainly. That's good. I think Hackett is definitely in the group of source data that we've been considering. And as you say, last planner and the collaborative working and whether collaborative working can influence planning effectiveness. There is initial research out there that suggests that things like the last planner system, can be successful in certain types of projects for sure. So definitely, thanks for highlighting that.
Okay, Tina, did you want to follow up?
No, just a very short comment. Good luck with your project, and maybe reflect on, long projects and short projects you might reflect on them differently depending on their duration. So, but good luck. I think time is out.
Yeah. Okay. And Pekka, I think you have just one contribution to make, and then we are going to close.
Yeah. Thanks, Dan, for your presentation. And just a suggestion, because the guys in Finland have also developed something new in this field, not only covering time but also costs and of course the design of any object and managing that. So I just put on the chat the contact information to these Hahtela companies if you are interested.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks so much for that. I've just seen that, so I'll take a copy of that. Thanks so much.
Okay, I just want to thank everybody for participating. I think we had a really balanced set of papers which touched on really quite different but complementary aspects of productivity and planning. And so thank you very much. And I look forward to seeing you at the future sessions.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.